The United States attacked Venezuela, not with a massive ground invasion, not with a long bombing campaign, but with a limited attack focused on weakening military spots designed at bringing confusion, hindering the government's strong hand, and ultimately at kidnapping the country's President Nicolás Maduro. And the first thing to understand is this. This is not just another crisis in Latin America. This is a geopolitical statement made with missiles and a special operation. Now, the discussion on whether the US committed an illegal attack is moot. There is no doubt, in fact, that from the point of view of the international law, the action is clearly against the UN Charter. Just like the previous attacks and killings on the boats of the alleged drug dealers performed without a due justice process, without a trial. But here is the more important point, and it's the point that people avoid because it is uncomfortable. International law was a thing as long as it served the interests of the hegemon. Today's geopolitical situation has, unfortunately, relegated the concept of an international order based on legal provisions to the archives of history. And we're back to the law of the strongest. So yes, it's illegal, but the deeper reality is that legality is no longer the main constraint. Power is. And of course, it's not the first time the US performs such aggressions, especially in Latin America. In 1989, for example, a very similar operation was performed in Panama. US forces abducted then President Manuel Noriega, flew him to the United States, put him on trial, and he was convicted, famously, to decades in prison. That precedent matters because it tells you what Washington thinks it can do in its strategic backyard. A similar fate is waiting Maduro, because the US cannot risk such an action, kidnapping a head of state, just to see its own courts later dismiss the case. Once you cross that line, you have to follow through. Otherwise, you reveal weakness. So what now? Well, the ousting of Maduro will not be enough to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Venezuela is not only one man, and a state doesn't disappear because its leader got captured. But it may well bring to a negotiated transition. Parts of the old establishment might determine it's better to come to terms with the US than to risk new operations, new arrests, and possible capture. This is how pressure works, not only by bombs, but by making the elites calculate fear and survival. And then comes the statement that should ring alarm bells across the region. US President Donald Trump already announced the US intends to run the country for the foreseeable future, but did not explain how they intend to do it. And this is where the reality becomes messy. Running the country can mean many things: a temporary administration, a security occupation, a protected transition, a puppet government, a stabilization mission under a friendly label. But whatever the label, the substance is the same. A sovereign state is being treated like a managed territory. Now, there is another scenario, and it is the darker one. A less orderly development where parts of the current government go into militia fighting, opening up a long guerrilla war. And a guerrilla war is exactly the kind of conflict that can destroy a country without producing a clear victory. It would cost many lives, mostly Venezuelan. But in this case, also US soldiers might be at risk if deployed on the ground. And once body bags come home, domestic politics in the United States can turn quickly. That's why limited strikes are often the easy part. Governing the aftermath is the hard part. So, what are the reasons for the attack? The excuse was drugs, and this is, of course, a joke. Venezuela is much less a culprit than, say, neighboring Colombia or Mexico. Of course, Venezuela's oil is a big reason for such attack. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and Trump, in his post-attack press conference, openly admitted that the US intend to use oil revenues as reimbursement for the damage allegedly caused by Venezuela on the US. a pretty funny justification for robbing a foreign country's natural reserves. But from a strategic point of view, not even oil is that important. What is at stake is the US hegemonic position on the entire Western Hemisphere, the so-called revived Monroe Doctrine, explicitly recalled by Trump as the guiding line of Washington's policy. This is the claim that the United States has the right to decide the geopolitical weather in both North and South America, from Argentina to Canada, and bear in mind, also Greenland. And from this perspective, the attack on Venezuela is mostly a strategic attack on the interests of the US' biggest geopolitical competitor, China. As explained in a video published just weeks ago, Venezuela became the principal partner of China in South America. In other words, it became a privileged channel, energy, finance, influence, a doorway for Beijing in the region. And this operation basically shuts that privileged channel to Beijing, much to the anger of Xi Jinping. Now, what are the geopolitical implications of this attack? Well, first of all, such operation is not a sign of strength but weakness of the United States. The fact that Washington had to resort to a military operation to affirm its interests show how its soft power is diminished. A confident hegemon persuades, a nervous one coerces. Second, with this attack, the US basically justified the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because if great powers can use force, capture leaders, and redraw political outcomes when it suits them, then the language of sovereignty becomes selective, and everyone else learns the lesson. But more importantly, it laid a potential justification for China's invasion on Taiwan, which could happen in the relatively near future. Taiwan can be strongly worried about this attack because it could be one of the elements bringing to an explicitly or implicitly agreed division of spheres of influence. The logic would become the US focuses more aggressively on the Americas, pushing out other contenders such as China and even minor competitors like Russia, and in exchange accepts more Chinese assertiveness in Asia. Not necessarily in writing, not as a treaty, but as a strategic reality emerging from choices, crises, and priorities. And internationally, while the European Union will be stuck trying to balance its official position in favor of a clearly violated international law and swallowing the fact that its hegemon, the United States, can basically do whatever it pleases, China and Russia will both use this event to condemn Washington in words. Those words matter because they will strengthen Beijing's and Moscow's leadership position in the so-called Global South. And they will strengthen further the cleavage between a US-dominated West and the rest of the world, leaning ever more into the sphere of influence of Beijing and its minor partner, Moscow. So fasten your seatbelts, because, like it or not, we are set for an ever more dangerous world in the forthcoming years.